Reason why our windshields are bigger than our rear view mirrors. There's a lot more in front of us that God has for us than what's behind us in so many ways. Not that we can forget the past, but we can't keep on looking in the rear view because we are called to move forward. You see, when we end up putting things in perspective, we come to an understanding that God is truly with us every step of the way. And I know it's easier said than done. Oftentimes when I'm in counseling and there's somebody in my office, I usually tell them, it's much easier for me to say it on this side of the desk than on that side. You're the one that has to go walk out these doors and go face life again. Not that I don't face my own trials, but sometimes what people are going through, it's like, man, but when we end up putting things in perspective, we understand that God will see us through. He's not just with us in the trials, but I think oftentimes he allows things to happen in our lives. And he allows it, and when I say that, people go like, but why would God be so mean to allow that to happen? And I think if you've walked with Jesus even for a little bit, I think you should understand, or you might understand, that life is not always easy. Everybody has hard times. Even those guys who don't know Jesus, they go through hard times, but they don't turn to him the way you can, the way you should. And God will use every little thing that happens in your life and in my life for our good and for his glory, if you allow him to do that. We've been going through the life of Joseph, and Joseph, if you've been following along, he's gone through a lot for the last 22 years. 22 years of his life. He's been in the midst of this thing. When he was 17 years old, his brothers sold him into slavery. 22 years later, he finds himself in a place that he is in second in command in Egypt, but yet, everything he went through, especially the first 13 years, he could have just refused to look forward and say, you know what, woe is me. Everybody hates me. Nobody loves me. I guess I'll eat some worms, right? And even though, again, he is second in command, it hasn't been without trials, hardships. Even though he's in that position, he's been away from his family for 22 years. And now those who caused this in his life, just about all of it, to get him to where he's at, are standing in his presence. And yes, he's kind of put them through the ringer somewhat. And yet he can look back, or he can look forward and realize God has been with me every step of the way. God has orchestrated every little bit of this to allow him to go through everything on behalf of them. How's that for a kick in the head? You go through all the trials so that you could bless the people who have hurt you the most. Ugh. But yet, it's been in that time that God has matured Joseph in such a way that he would never have gotten to that position unless he had gone through all the hardships. All of it. And because of that, God will do an amazing work, not only in Joseph, but throughout his family. We are standing here today because of what happened back then. And he saw him through because Jesus would be born through that line. I was thinking about just this whole thing, what if? And there's a lot of what ifs that we can play with, right? But what if his family wouldn't have come and they would have died out? Then I thought, well, then God would have started over with Joseph. But he didn't. Judah would be the line that Jesus would come through. And yet, when you read about Judah, he wasn't a great character. But let's read the first 8 verses of chapter 45, book of Genesis. Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried out, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Does my father still live?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come near to me." So they came near. Then he said, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years of famine have been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now, it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt." If you knew the story of Joseph, if you had read it in the past, if you were familiar with that whole story, and yet you hadn't read it for a while, and then you just opened up the Bible and decided, "I'm going to start reading the Bible," and you opened it up to chapter 45, and you just read that first sentence, you would think that this guy Joseph is having this nervous breakdown. You would think it's just by reading it, and then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him. He cried aloud, and he to make everyone go out from me. You're thinking this guy is kind of losing it right now. It would be as if you were walking in the middle of a service because you got here late, and you're walking in, and Pastor Zeke's already talking, right? And he's crying up there. Well, that wouldn't be a big stretch, because I cry often in front of you guys, right? Let's just say you came in and Pastor Gary was crying. Pastor Gary doesn't cry. He has no soul. He has no heart. And you can tell him I said as much. If he was crying, you'd come in going, "What? This guy's having a nervous breakdown," because he never cries. He never does anything like that. He doesn't even show emotion that much. And yet he can't restrain himself. He can't hold it back. And he's just crying. Now understand, when Joseph is crying here, when it says that he can't restrain himself, he is sobbing uncontrollably at this time. He can't hold it back any longer. Joseph has just got done hearing, and you almost have to go back a little bit. Joseph has just got hearing Joseph or Judah, his brother. He just got done, hearing this whole thing, how Judah has now put himself out there on behalf of his brother Benjamin. He has just put himself out there on behalf of his father Jacob. Judah was the one that when it was time to get rid of their brother Joseph all these years ago, was the one that said, well, instead of killing him, let's just sell him. So Joseph or Judah, he's kind of been the punk of this whole family for a little bit. But ever since they had to go back to Egypt to start doing all this stuff, he is the one that's kind of become the spokesman. As I've shared with you before, Joseph knew who they were the moment they came to him. And he starts putting them through the ringer, not because he's wanting to get back at them or be mean to them, although it kind of sounds like he does that on purpose, but he's wanting to see if there's sincerity in their heart, if something has changed in these people's lives, because he knows what they did to him. And he's putting them through the test to see if there's been changes in their life. Joseph, several times, at least 2 other times, when he's talked to his brothers and he's getting emotional, he kind of stops everything and goes into his chamber and he cries. And then he composes himself and comes back, but he doesn't let anybody see that he is so emotional seeing his brothers there. His heart loves them, even though they put him through everything that he's been through. And yet he gets to a point where he can't hold it any longer. Again, he just heard his brother put himself out there. This is the guy. And now he's standing up for his little brother, Benjamin, his real brother, their half-brother. He's standing up for him. They've lied to their dad for all these years, and now he's standing up for his dad. He's going, we can't put my dad through this anymore. Take me instead. Put me in prison and let my brothers go home to my dad, because if I don't show up with Benjamin, he's going to die. And so he has seen all of this. And now he can't hold back. You have to believe that the other times it wasn't time to reveal himself to his brothers. Again, some people might say, well, how come he just didn't do it right off the bat? Again, God's timing in all of this, not just for his brothers, but for him. There were still lessons to be learned on their behalf and on his behalf. And I think oftentimes we're going, but God, why can't you just fix this right now? Why can't I just take care of this right now? And he's going, not yet. And we struggle with that because you're going, are you allowing me to suffer even longer? With all the pain that he had seeing his brothers, he could have said, bro, this is me at that time. But God didn't allow him to do it because God was doing something in their lives. And now, because of everything that Joseph has been able to put them through, it's that time. But he hasn't been mean. Joseph has not been mean. He's been obedient to the Lord. And there's a difference when God tells you not yet. And even though you don't understand it, at the end of the day, you have to go, okay, Lord, you're sovereign and I'm not. You know it all. You're all powerful. You're all present. You're everything, Lord. And so I will wait on you. I don't know what got to Joseph more as he's hearing his brother Judah share all these things. I don't know what got to him more, hearing about his father and the pain that he has suffered through all these years, or hearing that the heart of Judah has changed, that he was willing to sacrifice his life for his brother and his father. And it's probably both. He heard all of this, and he's just going like, man, I can't keep this going any longer. Now it's time. So he's doing this, and he can't keep himself from doing this, from crying. and it's before all of these people that he is now crying in front of them. Again, most men, not all men, but most men, don't normally lose it like this. I know I cry. I can snivel here and there. But this is crying out of control. I think there's only been a few times in my life where I am crying so uncontrollably. Again, trying to hide it from everybody. And twice in my time of ministry, I think one time I cried harder for something that went on here that was going on than I did for my dad when he died. But normally, as men, we try to hold it. Nobody has seen Joseph do this before. In the 9 years now that he has been in charge of everything, nobody's ever seen him out of control. And when he cries out to them to tell everybody to go away and leave me alone, he is speaking Egyptian at this time. Again, he looks like an Egyptian. All of those things. And so you could only imagine that all the Egyptians, they're scurrying, they're hurrying to get out of his sight. This guy who is second in command only to Pharaoh is saying, everybody out of here. And man, they're going like, we're gone. But can you imagine Joseph's sons that are standing before him? They have no clue what he is saying and what is going on, except that guy's losing it up there. He's crying uncontrollably in front of them, and they have no clue what's going on. You have to know that most, if not all of these people, know that Joseph is not Egyptian. Maybe not all of them, but a lot of them know he's not Egyptian. He was the guy that was in prison, that's been in charge of us for the last 9 years. They all know that he's second in command and he wields a lot of power. And yet they're obeying his every command, and they leave. And they leave his presence, but they could hear him crying. And you could bet, man, as soon as they were on the other side of the door, man, their ears up against the door like, what is going on out there? They've never seen this before. And in verse 3, it says, Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? At that very point, Joseph goes from speaking Egyptian to speaking perfect Hebrew to his brothers. And now they hear the voice of their brother. You almost kind of wonder, like, how many things have we said in front of that guy? And he's known everything that we've been saying. But they hear the voice of their brother. And perhaps they heard that cry that they heard. that cry that they heard 22 years ago when he was in the pit, when they threw him in the pit. Perhaps they heard that cry when they sold Joseph to these people that were traveling by, and they have him in their cart and they're going out and he's crying as his voice is dying out. Can you imagine? They heard that cry now. And then he says to them, I'm Joseph, your brother. They were stunned. And yet he asks them, does my father still live? What is interesting is that they just heard that the old man was still alive from Judah. He just heard that. But it's almost as if he wants to be assured that he still has enough life in him that perhaps I might be able to see my father. Is he still alive? Will I be able to see him? But it says that his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. They were not only stunned, but this word dismayed means that they were disturbed. They were anxious. They were afraid. They were hurried and nervous. They were distressedly disturbed. In other words, they had this sinking feeling in their stomach that went down into their bowels. That feeling like something's wrong now. They're so scared that their knees are shaking, and it's like if they could find a bathroom, they'd find a bathroom right now. That's how scared they are. I'm sure that at this point they anticipated death. Not only from their own hearts stopping, and if that didn't kill them, then the death that should come because of what they've done to that man. They were anticipating judgment, I could imagine, when they're just stunned to hear this news that man that has been in charge of this whole thing is actually their little brother. Because there was no way that they could ever think that their brother was still alive after all these years. Being sold into slavery. The Egyptians worked these people to death. It's interesting because in my Bible here, there's a footnote, or there's a little reference when it says that they were like in shock, that they were so dismayed at his presence. And this reference takes us over to Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. And one commentator says this: their dismay was a preview, a prophecy of what will happen when the Jewish people again see Jesus and see him for who he really is. In Zechariah 12:10 says, "And I will pour out the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and supplication. Then they will look on him whom they pierced. Yes, they will mourn for him as one mourns for his only son, and grieve for him as one grieves for their firstborn." So the way that these guys were dismayed, shocked, in awe, when the Jews who didn't accept Jesus, when they see him for who they really are, who he really is, they're going to be so dismayed. They're going to be scared. That's the guy that we crucified. This is how crazy this little situation is here. And when he says to them, "I'm Joseph, come near to me." They were speechless, not only speechless, but they seemed to be paralyzed, motionless, frozen in time, if you will. It almost seemed like this was such a bad dream that it was this nightmare. Wake me up, because this guy's saying that he's our brother. And yet, he's telling us to come near. And what I found fascinating is that he says, "Come near." So they came near, and he says, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold to Egypt." And he reiterates what only they knew. Nobody else knew. And when it says that whom you sold to Egypt, what he means is whom you sold into slavery. And I think it's fascinating because, as I shared with you last week or the week before, whenever it was, I don't know if Benjamin has ever heard the story of what they did to his brother. Jacob, for sure, has never been told what they did to his son. And he says this to them as he reiterates what they did to him. In verse 5, he says, "But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry at yourselves because you sold me here." It wasn't you. God is the one that sent me before you. You have to wonder what they were thinking as all of this is unfolding. They've known, or he's known who they've been, who they are. They know how they've been treated by that man. He hasn't forgotten what they did to him, and now he's calling us to come near to him. And the fact that he's calling them to come near to him, he's actually telling them, you're not in danger here. I think wanting to calm their hearts somewhat. For him to say, guys, it wasn't you guys. For God sent me before you. Look at it, how verse 7 starts. And God sent me, he says in verse 7. God sent me before you. And then in verse 8 he says, so now it was not you who sent me here, but God. This is where Joseph, and again, I don't know how long he's been thinking about all this, but this is when he puts everything into perspective. Again, he had every right to retaliate against his brothers for what they had done to him. I think most men would do that. You did this, I'm going to do that. But God has done something in Joseph's life, and he has grown him and matured him. And I'm sure he played all these scenarios out in his mind, especially the first day that he saw them, that he couldn't handle it, and he goes and weeps and comes back. And with all the testing that was going on, he has been putting all these things into perspective to understand that God was the one that had control over all of this. Now, I'm not saying that Joseph never had his bouts of doubt. I think everybody would have their bouts of doubt. Really, God? Were you really in charge and allowing all this to happen? But knowing that at the end of the day, the God of his fathers has been with him and will continue to be with him, he understood that in the whole grand scheme of things, the God of his fathers had become his God. And he trusted in the sovereignty of who God is, that God knows everything. He is everywhere. He is all powerful. He could stop anything and he can allow anything to happen. And in all of that, again, we sometimes battle with that when we don't put things in perspective and we're just blaming God and crying and just, woe is me all the time, instead of going, okay, Lord, what do you want me to learn from this? Because you're allowing this to happen. And this is where, again, oftentimes when we're blaming God, it's because, again, I think to me, it's a lack of maturity in our lives of understanding who you really serve. Is he the sovereign God in your life? Do you, at the end of the day, going, Lord, you know everything. I trust that you are that big. Because if you don't trust him in that way, then you're going to always battle when something goes wrong in your life. Especially if it lingers for a week, right? Let it linger for 22 years. See if you're not like, I don't believe in you anymore. I hate you. And I'm sure he had those moments in his life. But at the end of the day, he came to understand, God, you're the one. You're the one that sent me here. There's nobody else to blame, Lord. I know that man did this to me, but you're in control of all of it. My life is in your hands, not in their hands. And I think when we can understand and we can reflect on the sovereignty of God, you understand that man can do nothing to you apart from God knowing it. I don't care what it is. When we come to that point in our life as Christians to trust Him with life and death, and death is not always the worst thing. When hardships and just all this craziness that happens, when you come to the understanding, it's like, but I will trust in you, Lord. I will trust you. Because He is ultimately in control. Then we end up looking at our circumstances around us with a whole different perspective. We have to. Because we're not big enough to control our own lives, even though we think we can. At the end of the day, He controls your breath. Not one of us, when we woke up this morning, not one of us was promised to see the end of this day. Not one of us. He controls that. And when you come to a point of saying, okay, Lord, I don't know if I will see the end of this day. I don't know if I will wake up tomorrow. But for right now, I worship you and I honor you. And I do what you tell me to do. And I follow that. It's not easy at times when everything is falling down and people are dying around you and hurting. But God had revealed to Joseph. He had revealed to his brothers that it took 13 years for all of them since they sold them into slavery, and then 7 more years after that, and then 2 years into this part, 22 years to get them all to this point. It took all of that time for Joseph to become the father of Pharaoh. And when he says that, it's more of a mentor to Pharaoh. It took him all that time to become the Lord of that household, to oversee that household. It took all that time for him to become the leader throughout all that land, to get them all to that point. And he reminds them that God had brought me here to save your lives, to preserve your lives. God allowed all of this to happen because He showed me and revealed to me that there was 7 years of plenty and 7 more years of famine. And we're only into 2, and there's 5 left, He's telling them. God sent me here, he says to them, to preserve the posterity, the future generations to come. Because it would be through that family that for some reason God chose that Jesus would come through that line. And so God had to protect them one way or another, even through hardship. All of Joseph's sorrows were for a purpose. All of them, just like they are in your life. They're for a purpose. Even if you can't understand it right now. The things that we go through right now, the things that we've gone through in the past, they've been for a purpose. Because many of you who have gone through so many things just like me, God can use them for His glory today if you allow Him. Amen. All of those things. To help someone else in their time of need, just like somebody helped you in your time of need. And this is what we don't always understand about the sovereignty of God. And again, it's far beyond us. But God would use him and this whole situation to preserve his entire family. And to provide the conditions for them to become a nation. They were just a people. There was less than 100 of them at this time. But they would become a nation in the nation of Israel. And yes, Joseph was the victim of man. But God turned all of that around for his glory. And none of what Joseph has gone through was a loss, just like you. Everything that you've gone through, God did not waste. He will use it for your life, to grow you, to mature you. If his family had not gone into Egypt, and I've shared this with you, then more than likely they would have assimilated very quickly, as we saw even Judah do a few chapters ago, by marrying the Canaanite women and allowing them to be mixed up in that whole pagan culture. But God wanted them to leave there to go to Egypt, because you know why? The Egyptians couldn't stand other people. They stayed to themselves. And God says, I will protect you and bring you over here, and I'm going to put you out right outside the city, and I'm going to give you the best land and all of this, but you will grow within yourselves, because he needed that nation to grow so that they could be that distinct people that Jesus would come through. And so God had to place them there so that they could grow. Verse 9 to 15. It says, after he shares all these things with them, Joseph speaking, he says, hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children, your children's children, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty. For there are still 5 years of famine. And behold, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin. See that it is my mouth that speaks to you. So you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that you have seen, and you shall hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them, and after that his brothers talked with him. So now that he has told them everything that God has done in his life, to put him in that place, and he understands that there's a huge change coming. He understands that. And he wants them to hurry up and go get their dad and bring him back so he can see his dad. And I know some people, well, why doesn't he just go with them? It's like, I don't know, maybe because he's the second in command right now, and there's a famine going on, and everybody is clamoring for him. He can't go. But he will provide everything for him. He goes, hey, listen, I got a piece of land for all you guys, and that will be yours. Again, I'm assuming he's already talked it over with Pharaoh. But he says, hurry and come back. And I thought, as I was reading this and studying this, I'm going, it's really easy for Joseph to say that. Hey, guys, it's me. It's me. Go tell Dad. Bring him back. But his brothers have a lot of explaining to do. Can you imagine? He says, hey, go tell Dad. This is what Joseph says. It's like, you don't understand, Joseph. Again, Benjamin is probably hearing this for the first time. What? They sold you into slavery? That's not what they've been telling Dad. They just brought back your coat, and Dad figured, oh, he's dead. Yes, he is, Dad. Yes, he is. Instead of going, we got to talk, Dad. The last time that Joseph had seen Benjamin was 1 year old. He's about 23 years old now. First time that he's really seen who his brother is. But Joseph's heart is to take care of his whole family. That's why God allowed him to go through everything he went through so that he could take care of them and see them through these next 5 years. He is so excited that I don't think it's really dawned on him. They're going to have to explain to their dad why their brother is still alive. And they've known all along. Now, what is interesting is it never really tells us that they explained this to him. But they're the ones that dug themselves into this hole. And God will hold them accountable. When he tells them in verse 12, see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. Again, he is speaking Hebrew to them. And he is speaking it perfectly. And he wants them to understand it really is me. In verses 14 and 15, again, this is where someone like me who is kind of sensitive at times can start crying. I'm sure he thought about his little brother a lot. I'm wondering if he ever thought, did my brothers hurt my brother? Again, Joseph and Benjamin are the only ones from Rachel. Did those guys hurt my little brother? What have they done to him? And then finding out that he is still alive when they first came to him, he couldn't wait to see him. And that's why he told them, unless you bring your little brother back, you'll never see my face again. And upon seeing him, all he wanted to do was go and hug him. And he couldn't. And it was probably killing him. And after hearing all the stories and all the stuff, that's when he just breaks down and realizes, I just want to see my little baby brother. I want to hug him. I want to smell him. I want to touch him. He couldn't wait. He couldn't hold it back. And now he gets the chance to kiss and hug his baby brother. And you can only imagine what Benjamin, what his mind is going through at this time. I thought my brother was dead and he's right here. And I finally get to talk to him and know him. But verse 15 is even more amazing. Moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. And what I see here is grace and mercy on display, because they don't deserve none of that. But only the Lord can do something like that in somebody's heart and life. To show mercy and grace to someone who wanted you dead. And because they didn't kill you, they sold you off into slavery. And for 22 years, that has been going on. And what we see here is this beautiful picture of the love of God for us. That while we were still sinners, while we still had a vendetta against God for whatever reason, he still loved us. He still sent his son. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That's the love of God. And it's interesting because that's what he calls us to do. To love people who have hurt us. To have compassion on someone that we don't want to have compassion on. Here he has his brothers who have done all this wickedness, who have kept the secret. And instead of punishing them, he kisses all of them and he weeps over all of them. They had been in this frozen state, man, that finally it says that after all of that, because you could imagine they're like, I'm sorry, brother. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And he's going, it's done. It's done, guys. That they finally, it says, and after that, his brothers talked to him. And what we see is God's grace and God's mercy in people's lives. Because again, when we are in those situations where we hold grudges, we hold bitterness, we hold all these ugly things, and God says, knock it off. I have forgiven you much, it's time for you to forgive much. Then we humble ourselves And we say, okay, Lord. And then you look at them as if they've done nothing to you. Isn't that hard? To treat someone as if they've never hurt you. And to love them. And there's people that say, I just can't love them. It's like, then don't. But love them. I told this one brother, fake it. Fake it. I said, if you can't love them the way Jesus would. Fake it that way. He goes, I know what you're doing. It's like, exactly. Because if you tell me that Jesus lives in you, then you can love like he loves because he lives in you. And it is possible. It is doable. I think just the pain and the hurt and the stubbornness and the pride and all those other good things that hold us from really doing that is what really keeps us from doing that. Because humility and using humility, it really works all the time. It just doesn't make you feel that great when you humble yourself and you love someone that doesn't deserve your love. But then again, even as I said that, you don't deserve God's love. And yet he pours it out time and time again. Verse 16, let's move on. Now the report of it was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brothers have come. So it pleased Pharaoh and his servants as well. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your animals and depart and go to the land of Canaan. Bring your father and your households and come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat the fat of the land. Now you are commanded, do this, take carts out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and your wives. Bring your father and come. Also, do not be concerned about your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Then the sons of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them carts according to the command of Pharaoh. And he gave them provisions for the journey. And he gave them all to each man changes of garments. But to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. And he sent to his father these things, 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and food for his father for the journey. So he sent his brothers away, and they departed. And he said to them, see that you do not become troubled along the way. I love the fact that, again, when Pharaoh and the whole household hears what's going on, again, all of them have been freaking out because Joseph had just been kind of losing it. And then when they realize, oh, it's a happy occasion. This is a good thing. Again, maybe some heard about this story, but now they're going, all of this is happening, and Pharaoh, I'm assuming that Joseph has let him know about all these things. But now Pharaoh is on board saying, get your dad over here. Get your whole family over here. Send all these carts, send all these moving trucks, basically. Load up and, from, I was watching the Beverly Hillbillies the other day, that song. So they loaded up the truck and they moved to Egypt. Goshen, that is. But the fact is, he says, leave everything. Just leave everything. Just bring what you really, really need and come over here and you will have it all. Everything you need. And yet, as they're leaving and he loads them down with everything that they need, verse 24, he tells his brothers, see that you do not become trouble along the way. Don't fight as you leave here. Because he knew they're going to go like, but you shouldn't have done this. Well, you shouldn't have done. Well, you shouldn't. He says, don't do that to yourselves. Don't do that. Don't replay these last 22 years. God has sent me here to do this. You go and take care of what you need to go take care of. What he should have said, and make sure you guys get your story straight when you go and talk to Dad, that I'm still alive. And so in verse 25 to the end here. He says, then they went out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan, to Jacob their father. And they told him, saying, Joseph is still alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart stood still, because he did not believe them. And when they told him all the words which Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. Then Israel said, it is enough. Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. How, what? I know what we read right here, but how did they explain to him that he is still alive? It's interesting because Joseph had told him, tell my dad everything that I'm doing now. All the goodness, all the riches, all the stuff. They really didn't go into detail. And even if they did, the only thing that Jacob was really concerned about is like, what? My son is still alive? I don't care what. I don't care if he's a pauper. I don't care. He's still alive. I need to go see him before I die. And again, now he will have, I think it's about another 14 years, 17 years before he does die. But at that time, his heart stopped. However it was. I'm sure it's like, come on, Dad. Come on, Dad. Come back. Get the defibrillator up there. You know, it's like, but you can imagine this man thinking, you're telling me my son is alive. That doesn't happen every day. And for all these years, he thought his son was dead. And yet, God had prepared him over there without him knowing anything so that they can bring their family. Up until this time, there's still less than 100 left, or 100. If they wouldn't have come back, this famine was so severe that it would have wiped them all out. God, in his sovereignty, moved them over. They will be there for 4 centuries. For over 400 years, but they will become a nation there. And they will leave there with over 2 million people. Because this is what God had in store for them. Again, they're going to mess things up. We know the story. But he brings them there because he protected them in Egypt. And they became a nation so you and I can glean from that and be grafted into the nation of Israel, if you will, because Jesus comes through all of that. Isn't that amazing? Father, thank you once again for showing us these stories, Lord, that we can reflect on, that we can look at. Lord, again, it's hard for us to really understand your sovereignty, Lord. It is way beyond us that we can try to comprehend that you know it all. That you see from beginning to end, Lord. You are the God who was and is to come, Lord. You are the Almighty One, Lord. You are all powerful. You are all knowing. You are all present, Lord. And Lord, whether we truly comprehend it or not, Lord, we believe it. And we want to come to a place, Lord, even in our own lives, that we can put things in perspective, that this is the God that we serve. The one that knows it all, the one that sees it all, the one that is all powerful. And we can put all our weight in you to be able to trust you for what we're going through today, because you've seen us through this life and you will see us until our last breath, Lord. And so we honor you and we thank you, Lord, for your goodness and your grace. And we bless you, Lord. And I pray for my brothers and sisters here right now, that, Lord, if this message is ministered to their heart and through their soul, that somehow, Lord, they would be able to just mature even just a little bit more today, understanding who you are. We love you. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's